The first bullet ripped through the New York night sky just as Lucien Vale realized his sham marriage had become the only thing worth dying for. Blood flowed across the floor of the $1 million penthouse. His wife, the woman he bought with a cold contract, stood between him and the gun barrel, her eyes showing no fear. His enemy wanted him to kneel. But for the first time in his life, Lucien Vale feared losing something more than his own life. This is the story of a criminal who never believed in love until it nearly destroyed him. Watch to the end, and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come. The rain came down like bullets that night, hammering the streets of Lower Manhattan until the gutters choked and the city smelled like rust and gasoline. Lucien Vale stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, 30 stories above the chaos, and watched New York drown beneath him. He didn't feel the cold, hadn't felt much of anything in years. That's what happened when you built an empire on the bones of men who underestimated you. You went numb, or you went insane. Tonight, he was supposed to get married, not because he wanted to, not because some woman had crawled under his skin and made him weak, but because Antonio Arden, a man who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront and half the heroin flowing through the eastern seaboard, needed an alliance, and Lucien needed Antonio's distribution network to survive the war brewing in Queens. Marriage was cleaner than bloodshed, cheaper too. The Arden family got legitimacy through Lucien's Wall Street fronts. Lucien got access to ports that could move anything from pharmaceuticals to people without the feds sniffing around. It was business, cold, calculated, the kind of deal Lucien had been making since he was 16 and put a bullet in his first man. "Boss," the voice came from behind him. Matteo, his right hand, a stocky man with knuckles like raw meat and a scar that split his left eyebrow in half. "Car's ready. We leave in 10. Lucien didn't turn around. "She know what this is?" "The girl?" Matteo's laugh was ugly. "Antonio's daughter? She knows. Probably hates your guts already." "Good." Lucien straightened his cufflinks, each one worth more than most men made in a year. Hate's easier to manage than hope. The ceremony was set for 8. Private venue uptown, something old and expensive with stained glass and vaulted ceilings, the kind of place that made dirty money look respectable. 50 people. No press. No cameras. Just the families and their enforcers, all of them armed, all of them waiting to see if this alliance would hold, or if someone would start shooting before the vows finished. Lucien had survived worse odds. He turned from the window, grabbed his coat, black, tailored, Italian, and headed for the elevator. Matteo followed, silent except for the click of his boots on marble. The ride down felt longer than it should have. 30 floors of silence and the hum of machinery. Lucien's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors, sharp jaw, dark eyes that never softened, a face people remembered because it was usually the last thing they saw before things went bad. He looked like a man going to a funeral. Maybe he was. The car was waiting in the underground garage. Black SUV, bulletproof glass, engine running. 2 more men in the back, both carrying enough firepower to start a small war. Lucien slid into the passenger seat and Matteo took the wheel. No one spoke. The city blurred past. Wet streets, neon signs, people huddled under awnings trying to escape the rain. Lucien watched it all with the detachment of a man who owned too much and cared about too little. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to the venue. It was smaller than he expected. Older. The kind of building that had seen 100 years of secrets and still stood because no one wanted to tear down something that beautiful. Stone steps led up to heavy wooden doors. Rain pounded the awning overhead. Lucien stepped out, adjusted his collar, and felt the weight of the gun holstered against his ribs. Just in case. Inside, the air was thick with expensive cologne and tension. The Arden family had claimed the left side, 15 men in dark suits, all of them watching Lucien like wolves sizing up a rival pack. Antonio Arden stood near the front, a gray-haired bull of a man with hands that had strangled more people than Lucien cared to count. He nodded once. Lucien nodded back. That was it. No warmth. No pretense. Lucien's people took the right side. Matteo stayed close, hand resting casually near his jacket. The officiant, some hired priest who probably didn't ask questions as long as the check cleared, stood at the front, looking uncomfortable and pale. Then the music started. Lucien didn't know what he expected. Some trembling girl in white, maybe. Someone small and forgettable, the kind of daughter powerful men kept locked away until they needed her for leverage. He'd seen the photograph Antonio sent, grainy, distant, taken at some charity event. Dark hair, average height, nothing remarkable. The doors at the back opened, and Lucien's entire strategy collapsed. The woman walking toward him wasn't trembling, wasn't small, wasn't forgettable. Serafina Arden moved down the aisle like she owned every inch of ground her feet touched, and the white dress she wore wasn't some delicate thing meant to make her look innocent. It was armor. Silk and lace cut sharp enough to draw blood. Her dark hair fell in waves over bare shoulders, and her eyes, Christ, her eyes, locked onto Lucien's with the kind of intensity that made grown men confess sins they hadn't even committed yet. She wasn't afraid of him. That was the first problem. She reached the front and Antonio stepped forward to hand her off like she was cargo. But Serafina didn't wait for permission. She stepped past her father, past the officiant, and stopped directly in front of Lucien. Close enough that he could smell her perfume, something dark and floral that didn't match the coldness in her stare. "Let's get this over with," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, and sharp enough to cut glass. Lucien's jaw tightened. He didn't like surprises. "You always this warm at weddings?" "Only the ones that matter." She tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was a problem she intended to solve. "You're shorter than I expected." Matteo coughed behind him, probably covering a laugh. Lucien's eyes narrowed. "And you've got a mouth that's going to get you in trouble. Good thing you're not marrying me for conversation." The officiant cleared his throat nervously. Should we begin?" Lucien didn't move. Neither did Serafina. They stood there, locked in some silent war neither of them intended to lose. Around them, the families shifted, hands drifting toward weapons, tension rising like water about to boil over. Finally, Lucien spoke. "Yeah, let's begin." The ceremony was a blur. Words that meant nothing. Vows that were lies. Lucien said what he was supposed to say, and Serafina did the same, her voice steady and cold. When it came time for the ring, Lucien slid it onto her finger, platinum, flawless, expensive enough to buy a house, and felt her hand stiffen under his touch. "You may kiss the bride." Lucien hesitated. This was supposed to be for show, a performance, but when he leaned in, Serafina didn't pull back, didn't flinch. She met him halfway, and the kiss was brief, cold, and tasted like gasoline poured over a lit match. When they pulled apart, her eyes were still on his, unreadable. "Congratulations," she whispered. "We're both trapped now." The reception lasted an hour. Champagne no one drank. Food no one touched. Two families pretending they weren't seconds away from killing each other. Lucien shook hands, accepted forced smiles, and felt Serafina's presence beside him like a loaded gun he couldn't holster. She didn't speak to him, didn't touch him, just stood there, playing the role of dutiful wife while her eyes tracked every exit, every weapon, every person in the room who might be a threat. Smart. Too smart. By the time they left, the rain had turned into a downpour. The SUV was waiting. Lucien climbed in first, and Serafina followed, the door slamming shut behind her like a prison cell locking. Matteo took the wheel again. No one spoke. The penthouse was dark when they arrived. Lucien flipped on the lights. Cold, modern, all steel and glass and empty space. It looked like a place where people worked, not lived. Serafina walked past him without a word, heels clicking on marble, and disappeared down the hall toward the guest room. Lucien stood there, coat still on, rain dripping onto the floor, and realized he had no idea what happened next. He poured himself a drink. Whiskey, neat, expensive enough to taste like smoke and regret, and sat down on the couch. The city stretched out below him, lights flickering like dying stars. Somewhere out there, men were making deals, breaking bones, settling scores. His world, his kingdom. And now he had a wife who looked at him like she could see straight through the armor. An hour passed, maybe two. Lucien didn't move, didn't drink, just sat there, staring at nothing, until he heard footsteps behind him. Serafina stood in the doorway, still in her wedding dress, hair loose around her shoulders. She'd taken off her shoes. Her feet were bare, small, pale against the dark floor. "We should talk," she said. Lucien set down his glass. "About what?" "The rules." There are no rules. Then let me make some. She crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and sat down across from him. Not beside him. Across. Like they were negotiating a business deal. I'm not going to pretend this is a real marriage. You don't love me. I sure as hell don't love you, but if we're going to survive this, we need boundaries. Lucien leaned back, studying her. I'm listening. You stay out of my way, I stay out of yours. You don't touch me unless it's for show. You don't ask where I go or who I see, and if someone tries to use me as leverage against you, her eyes hardened. You let them try. That's suicide. That's survival. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, close enough that Lucien could see the exhaustion hiding behind her defiance. My father sold me to you like I was property. You bought me because you needed access to his empire. Fine, but don't mistake me for some helpless thing you can lock away and forget about. I'm not your weakness. I'm not your liability. I'm a ghost in your house. And when this alliance falls apart, because it will, I'll disappear, and you'll never see me again. Lucien didn't respond right away. He should have been angry, should have put her in her place, reminded her who held the power here. But something about the way she said it, calm, certain, like she'd already mapped out every exit, made him pause. You really think it's going to fall apart? He asked. I think men like you don't know how to stop taking until there's nothing left. She stood up, smoothing down her dress. So yeah, it'll fall apart. Just a matter of time. She walked away, back toward the hallway, and Lucien sat there in the silence she left behind. He told himself it didn't matter, that she was wrong, that this was just another deal, another piece on the board, nothing more. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a warning bell started ringing, and Lucien Vale never ignored warnings. The first week was a war of silence. Serafina stayed in the guest room. Lucien stayed in his office. They moved through the penthouse like ghosts haunting the same house, never speaking, never touching, never acknowledging the strange, suffocating tension that filled every room. Lucien told himself it was better this way, easier. He had work to do, shipments to coordinate, rivals to crush, territories to defend. The marriage had given him access to Antonio's ports, and he was already moving product through Brooklyn faster than the feds could track. Money poured in, power consolidated. Everything was going according to plan. Except at night, when he came home and found Serafina sitting in the dark by the window, staring out at the city like she was planning an escape. You don't sleep much, he said one night, startling her. She didn't turn around. Neither do you. I've got reasons. So do I. Lucien walked over, hands in his pockets, and stood beside her. Below them, the city pulsed and bled. Sirens in the distance, lights flickering, lives being lived and destroyed in equal measure. You afraid of something? Serafina finally looked at him, and for the first time Lucien saw something other than defiance in her eyes. Something raw, tired. I'm afraid of becoming like you. The words hit harder than they should have. Lucien's jaw clenched. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. She stood up, facing him fully now. I know you've killed people. I know you don't feel guilty about it. I know you wake up every morning and convince yourself that power is the same thing as safety. It is. No. She shook her head slowly. It's just a bigger cage. Before Lucien could respond, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and felt his blood go cold. Matteo. We've got a problem. Queens. Now. Lucien looked up at Serafina, and for a split second, he saw something shift in her expression. Concern, maybe, or recognition that whatever piece they'd managed to carve out was about to shatter. I have to go, he said. Then go. He hesitated. He didn't know why. Didn't know what he expected her to say. But when he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Lucien. He looked back. Don't die tonight, she said quietly. I'm not interested in being a widow yet. It wasn't affection, wasn't love, but it was something, and it was enough to make him pause before walking out the door into the rain. By the time Lucien reached the warehouse in Queens, 2 of his men were already dead. Matteo was crouched behind a stack of crates, gun drawn, face streaked with blood that wasn't his. Across the concrete floor, 4 men in dark jackets returned fire. Russians, from the look of them, part of Volkov's crew. Lucien pulled his gun, chambered around, and stepped into the fight. The first man went down before he knew Lucien was there. Clean shot, center mass, no hesitation. The second turned, got off one wild shot that shattered a window, and then Lucien put him down too. The remaining two scattered, but Matteo moved fast, cutting off the exit, and within 30 seconds, it was over. Silence settled over the warehouse like ash. Lucien walked over to the bodies, nudged one with his boot. "Why'd they come here?" "Message," Matteo said, breathing hard. "Volkov's pissed about the Brooklyn deal. Says we're moving in on his territory." "We're not." "He thinks we are." Lucien holstered his gun, mind already racing through scenarios. If Volkov wanted war, it wouldn't stay contained. It would spill into the streets, drag in the other families, force everyone to pick sides. And the moment that happened, the alliance with Antonio would fracture under pressure, unless Lucien ended it first. "Set up a meet," Lucien said. "Tomorrow, neutral ground. I'll handle Volkov myself." Matteo wiped blood off his face. "You sure that's smart?" "No." Lucien turned toward the exit, stepping over bodies like they were furniture. "But it's necessary." He didn't go home right away. Couldn't, not with adrenaline still screaming through his veins and the taste of gunpowder on his tongue. Instead, he drove through the city, windows down, rain soaking his shirt, until his hands stopped shaking and his mind cleared. By the time he walked back into the penthouse, it was almost dawn. Serafina was in the kitchen. She stood at the counter in an oversized shirt and bare legs, making coffee like it was the most normal thing in the world. She looked up when Lucien walked in, her gaze sweeping over him. Damp clothes, bruised knuckles, the kind of exhaustion that came from violence. "You're alive," she said flatly. "Disappointed?" "Not yet." She poured a second cup of coffee and slid it across the counter toward him. "You look like hell." Lucien picked up the cup, drank, felt the heat burn down his throat. "It was a long night." "I heard." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Gunshots on the police scanner. Warehouse fire in Queens. That you?" Lucien set down the cup. "You listen to police scanners?" "I like to know when my husband's about to get himself killed." There was something different in her voice. Not warmth, exactly, but not hostility either. Something closer to curiosity. Like she was trying to figure out whether he was worth the effort of caring about. "I'm fine," Lucien said. "This time. Every time." Serafina studied him for a long moment, then pushed off the counter and walked over. She stopped close enough that Lucien could smell her shampoo, something clean and sharp. Up close, she looked younger than she acted. Tired. Human. "You know what I think?" she said quietly. "What?" "I think you're terrified of being weak." Her eyes searched his. "So you keep building walls, keep making enemies, keep convincing yourself that fear is the same thing as respect." Lucien's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe." She reached out, hesitated, then gently touched the bruise forming on his jaw. Her fingers were cool, careful. "Or maybe I'm the only person in this city who sees you clearly." Before Lucien could respond, she pulled her hand back and walked away, disappearing down the hall without another word. And Lucien stood there in the empty kitchen, coffee going cold in his hand, and realized something terrifying. He wanted her to stay. The meeting with Volkov was set for noon at a shipping yard in Red Hook, neutral territory theoretically, though Lucien knew there was no such thing as neutral when it came to men who built kingdoms on violence. He went alone, against Matteo's protests, against every instinct that told him walking into a meeting with the Russians without backup was suicide dressed up as strategy. But Lucien had learned a long time ago that fear was a weapon, and the only way to disarm it was to show up where no one expected you to. The yard was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and broken concrete. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and desperate. Lucien stepped out of his car, hands visible, no weapons, at least none they could see. The cold bit through his jacket. January in New York felt like the city was punishing everyone for still being alive. Volkov was waiting near a stack of containers, flanked by three men who looked like they bench-pressed refrigerators for fun. The Russian was older than Lucien, mid-50s, with gray hair slicked back and a face that looked like it had been carved from concrete and spite. He didn't smile when Lucien approached, didn't acknowledge him beyond a slight nod. "You have balls," Volkov said in heavily accented English. "Coming here alone." "You asked for a meeting. I'm here." Lucien stopped 10 feet away, keeping the distance deliberate. What do you want? I want to know why you think you can move product through Brooklyn without my permission. Because Brooklyn isn't yours. Volkov's jaw tightened. Everything east of the river has been mine for 15 years. Was yours. Lucien kept his voice level, cold. Antonio Arden controls the ports now, and I control Antonio. It was a lie, of course. Antonio controlled himself, and Serafina controlled more than Lucien wanted to admit. But Volkov didn't need to know that. So you marry his daughter and think that makes you king? Volkov laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're a child playing at Empire. Then why are you here? Lucien took a step closer. If I'm just a child, why waste your time? Volkov's smile vanished. Because children need to be reminded where the edges are. I don't have edges. Everyone has edges. Volkov gestured and one of his men stepped forward, dropping a duffel bag at Lucien's feet. Open it. Lucien didn't move. What's in it? Open it, or I'll have Dmitri open your throat. Lucien crouched slowly, unzipped the bag, and felt his stomach turn to ice. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Serafina leaving the penthouse, Serafina at a coffee shop in Soho, Serafina walking through Central Park, each one time-stamped, dated, catalogued like evidence in a case file. Lucien's hand closed into a fist. She's very beautiful, Volkov said casually. Your wife. It would be a shame if something happened to her. Lucien stood up slowly, and when he looked at Volkov, something in his expression made the Russian's men shift nervously. You touch her, and I'll burn everything you own to the ground. Then stay out of Brooklyn. Volkov stepped closer, close enough that Lucien could smell cigarettes and cheap cologne. Or next time, I won't send photographs. I'll send pieces. Lucien didn't respond. Couldn't. Because the rage building inside him was the kind that turned men into monsters, and if he opened his mouth, he'd say something that would start a war right here, right now. Instead, he picked up the duffel bag, turned, and walked back to his car. He didn't drive home. Couldn't. Not with his hand shaking and the taste of violence coating his tongue like poison. Instead, he drove to an empty lot in the Bronx, got out, and put his fist through the car window. Glass shattered. Blood welled up across his knuckles. Pain followed, sharp and grounding. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at his reflection in the broken glass, and realized the truth he'd been avoiding since the night he married her. Serafina had become a target the moment she walked down that aisle, and Lucien had no idea how to keep her safe without admitting she mattered. When he finally walked back into the penthouse, it was late afternoon. The light coming through the windows was cold and gray, casting everything in shades of exhaustion. Serafina was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, bare feet tucked under her, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up when Lucien walked in, and her expression shifted immediately. What happened to your hand? Nothing. That's not nothing. She set down the book and stood up. You're bleeding. It's fine. It's not fine. She crossed the room, grabbed his wrist before he could pull away, and examined the damage. Her touch was firm, clinical, but there was something else beneath it. Concern, maybe, or frustration that he kept showing up broken. You need to clean this. I can handle it. Clearly. She pulled him toward the kitchen, ignoring his protests. Sit. Lucien sat, more out of surprise than obedience. Serafina disappeared into the bathroom and came back with a first aid kit. She worked in silence, cleaning the cuts with antiseptic that burned like hell, wrapping gauze around his knuckles with hands that were steadier than his. You want to tell me what happened? She asked quietly. No. Fine. She tied off the gauze but didn't let go of his hand. But whatever it is, you're bringing it home with you, and I can feel it from across the room. Lucien looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who wasn't supposed to matter but somehow did. Volkov's targeting you. Serafina's hand stilled. What? He's got men following you, taking pictures. He knows your routine, where you go when you're alone. Lucien's jaw clenched. He's using you as leverage. For a moment, Serafina didn't respond. Then she released his hand and took a step back, arms crossing over her chest like armor. So what are you going to do? Keep you safe. How? I don't know yet. That's not good enough. Her voice was sharp now, cutting. You can't just lock me in here and hope the problem goes away. I'm not. Oh? Yes, you are. She leaned against the counter, eyes blazing. That's what men like you do. You see a threat, and you cage what you're trying to protect until the cage becomes the threat. I'm trying to keep you alive. I didn't ask for that. The words hung between them like a slap. Lucien stood up, towering over her, but Serafina didn't back down. Didn't flinch. Just stared up at him with the kind of defiance that made him want to shake her and kiss her in equal measure. You think I want this? Lucien's voice was low, dangerous. You think I want to care whether you live or die? Then don't. Serafina stepped closer, chin tilted up. You didn't want a wife. You wanted an asset, so treat me like one. Use me as bait. Let Volkov come. Maybe we'll both get what we want. And what's that? Freedom. Lucien's hand moved before he could stop it, catching her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, rough and trembling. You think freedom's waiting for you on the other side of this? I think it's better than being trapped here with you. She said it like a challenge, like she wanted him to prove her wrong. And God help him, Lucien wanted to. Wanted to show her that what was building between them wasn't a cage. It was something worse, something that would destroy them both if they let it. But before he could move, before he could close the distance and make the mistake he'd been avoiding for weeks, his phone buzzed. Matteo. Antonio wants a meeting. Tonight. Says it's urgent. Lucien's hand dropped. Serafina stepped back, breathing hard, eyes unreadable. Go, she said quietly. Do what you do. Serafina. Go. He left. He didn't want to, but he did. Because that's what men like him did. They walked away from the things that mattered and told themselves it was for the best. Antonio's estate was in Staten Island, a sprawling compound hidden behind walls and security cameras and men with guns. Lucien had been here once before, the night Antonio proposed the marriage alliance. Back then, it had felt like a negotiation. Tonight, it felt like a trap. Matteo drove. Neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, loaded with the kind of tension that came before violence. When they pulled up to the gates, guards waved them through without checking IDs. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Inside, Antonio was waiting in his office, a room that smelled like cigars and old wood and money that had been laundered so many times it forgot where it came from. He was alone, which was unusual. Antonio never met anyone alone. Sit, Antonio said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Lucien sat. Matteo stayed by the door, hand resting casually near his jacket. Antonio poured 2 glasses of whiskey, slid one across the desk. You've been busy. I've been working. You've been making enemies. Antonio leaned back, studying Lucien like a scientist examining something under a microscope. Volkov called me this morning, said you're moving product through my ports without coordinating shipments, said it's causing problems. Volkov's lying. Is he? Antonio took a sip of whiskey. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you married my daughter to get access to Brooklyn, and now you're cutting me out of my own territory. Lucien's jaw tightened. That's not what's happening. Then explain it to me. I don't owe you explanations. Antonio's expression darkened. You married into my family. That means everything you do reflects on me. And right now, you're making me look weak. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you sold your daughter to the highest bidder. The words came out harsher than Lucien intended. Antonio's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles going white. For a moment, Lucien thought the old man might throw it. Instead, Antonio set it down carefully, deliberately. Be very careful how you speak to me, boy. I'm not your boy. No. Antonio stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped inches from Lucien's chair. But you're married to my daughter, and that makes you my problem. Lucien stood up, meeting Antonio's glare head-on. They were the same height, the same build, 2 predators circling in a space too small for both of them. You want to make this a problem? Fine. But don't forget who's moving your product and keeping your empire from collapsing. And don't forget who gave you access in the first place. Antonio's voice dropped to a whisper. I can take it away just as easily. You could try. Matteo shifted by the door. Antonio's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Lucien. The air in the room was thick enough to choke on. Finally, Antonio stepped back. "Get out!" Lucien didn't argue. He turned, walked toward the door, and was halfway out when Antonio's voice stopped him. "Lucien!" He looked back. "If anything happens to Serafina," Antonio said quietly, "I'll hold you responsible." Lucien didn't respond, just walked out, Matteo close behind, and didn't breathe normally until they were back in the car. "That went well," Matteo said dryly. Lucien stared out the window. Drive. They were halfway back to Manhattan when Lucien's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then instinct kicked in, and he picked up. Vale. Static. Then a voice. Distorted. Mechanical. "You should have stayed out of Brooklyn." Lucien's blood went cold. "Who is this?" "Go home, Lucien. See what happens when you ignore warnings." The line went dead. Lucien looked at Matteo. "Drive faster." The penthouse was dark when they arrived. Too dark. The lights that were always on, the ones Serafina left burning because she hated coming home to an empty, lifeless space, were off. Lucien's heart slammed against his ribs as he pushed through the door, gun drawn, every nerve screaming. "Serafina!" Silence. He moved through the penthouse room by room, Matteo covering his back, both of them expecting blood, bodies, the kind of carnage that came when men like Volkov made good on threats. But there was nothing. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood, just emptiness. Lucien checked her room. Her clothes were still in the closet. Her phone was on the nightstand. Her shoes were by the door. But she was gone. Lucien stood in the middle of the living room, breathing hard, mind racing through every possibility, every nightmare scenario, every way this could end badly. Then he saw it. A piece of paper on the kitchen counter, folded once, his name written on the outside in handwriting he didn't recognize. He picked it up, unfolded it, and read, "We have her. You have 48 hours to pull out of Brooklyn and transfer port operations back to Volkov. If you don't, we start sending pieces. Don't call the police, don't involve Antonio. Just do what you're told, and maybe you'll see your wife again." The paper crumpled in Lucien's fist. Matteo was talking, saying something about calling the crew, mobilizing everyone, tearing the city apart until they found her. But Lucien wasn't listening, because for the first time in his life, the empire he'd built meant nothing. The power, the money, the fear. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting her back. And Lucien Vale was about to remind everyone in this city why they were afraid of him in the first place. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number he hadn't called in years, and waited. 2 rings. Then a voice, rough and tired. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet." Lucien's voice was flat, empty. "But I need your help." "What kind of help?" "The kind that ends with bodies." A pause. Then, "Where and when?" Lucien gave the address. Hung up. Looked at Matteo. "Call everyone, Chase," Lucien said. "I don't care where they are or what they're doing. I want every man we have armed and ready in 2 hours. Boss, if we go to war with Volkov, I'm not going to war." Lucien checked his gun, chambered around. "I'm going to burn his entire world to the ground." Matteo stared at him. "You sure about this?" Lucien thought about Serafina sitting by the window in the dark, thought about her hands cleaning his wounds, thought about the way she looked at him like she could see past the monster to the man he used to be. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm sure." 2 hours later, Lucien stood in a warehouse in Brooklyn surrounded by 20 armed men, all of them loyal, all of them ready to die if he asked. The air smelled like oil and sweat and anticipation. Someone had set up a table with maps of the city, marked with red circles indicating Volkov's known locations. Lucien stared at the maps and felt nothing. No fear, no hesitation, just cold, calculated rage. "We hit 3 locations simultaneously," he said, voice carrying through the warehouse. "His distribution center in Queens, his counting house in the Bronx, and his private club in Brighton Beach. I want them gutted. I want every dollar, every ledger, every piece of leverage he has turned to ash." One of the men spoke up. "What about casualties?" "I don't care about casualties." Lucien looked up, and the expression on his face made grown men take a step back. I care about sending a message. And what message is that? That you don't take what's mine and expect to live. The room went quiet. Matteo stepped forward. Boss, this is going to bring hell down on all of us. Good. Lucien holstered his gun. Let it come. They moved out in 3 teams, synchronized, professional. Lucien led the team hitting Brighton Beach, Volkov's stronghold, the place where the Russian felt safest. It was a mistake. Safety was an illusion. Lucien had learned that a long time ago. The club was in the basement of an old theater, hidden behind a Russian restaurant that smelled like borscht and corruption. 2 guards stood outside, both armed, both bored. They didn't see Lucien coming until it was too late. The first guard went down without a sound, Matteo's knife finding the soft spot between his ribs. The second reached for his gun, and Lucien shot him twice, center mass, silenced rounds that sounded like whispers in the night. They dragged the bodies inside, locked the door behind them, and descended into the club. Music pounded through the walls, some Russian pop song Lucien didn't recognize. The air was thick with smoke and cheap perfume. Men in expensive suits sat at tables, drinking vodka, laughing, oblivious. Lucien stepped into the middle of the room and fired a shot into the ceiling. The music stopped. Everyone froze. Where's Volkov? Lucien's voice cut through the silence like a blade. No one answered. Lucien walked over to the nearest table, grabbed one of the men by his tie, and dragged him out of his chair. I asked a question. The man's eyes were wide, terrified. I don't know. Lucien put the gun to his temple. Wrong answer. Wait! Another man stood up, hands raised. He's not here. He never comes here anymore. Then where is he? I don't know. I swear. Lucien pulled the trigger. The man's body hit the floor. The room erupted, screaming, people scrambling for exits, chaos spreading like wildfire. Lucien let them run. He didn't care about them. They were insects, collateral damage. He walked through the club, overturning tables, smashing bottles, looking for anything that might tell him where Volkov was hiding. Behind the bar, he found an office. Inside, a safe. Lucien shot the lock off, pulled it open, and found stacks of cash, passports, and a ledger. He grabbed the ledger, flipped through it, and found addresses, properties, warehouses, and one circled in red. Staten Island, Pier 7. Lucien's jaw clenched. Staten Island, where Antonio's estate was. He pulled out his phone, dialed Matteo. Change of plans. Everyone converges on Staten Island, Pier 7. Boss, that's it. I know where it is. Just do it. He hung up, pocketed the ledger, and walked out of the club, leaving fire and chaos in his wake. By the time Lucien reached Staten Island, dawn was breaking over the water, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. Pier 7 was an old shipping dock, abandoned years ago, the kind of place where bodies disappeared and no one asked questions. Lucien parked half a mile away and approached on foot, gun drawn, every sense on high alert. The pier was quiet, too quiet. He moved between shipping containers, staying low, until he saw them. 4 men standing guard outside a warehouse at the end of the dock, and through the cracked door, a single overhead light illuminating a figure tied to a chair. Serafina. Lucien's heart stopped. She was alive. Bruised, bloodied, but alive. Her head hung forward, hair covering her face, hands bound behind her back. Rage exploded through Lucien like a bomb. He didn't wait for backup, didn't think, didn't plan. He just moved. The first guard went down before he could shout. Lucien's knife through his throat, quick and silent. The second turned, and Lucien shot him twice, center mass. The third reached for his radio, and Lucien put a bullet through his hand, then his head. The fourth guard ran. Lucien let him. He'd deal with him later. He kicked open the warehouse door, gun raised, and found Volkov standing behind Serafina, a gun pressed to the back of her head. Drop it, Volkov said calmly. Lucien didn't move. Drop it, or I kill her right now. You kill her, and you're dead before she hits the ground. Volkov smiled. Then we both lose. Serafina's head lifted. Her eyes found Lucien's, and even through the blood and exhaustion, there was something fierce burning in them. Something unbroken. Don't, she whispered. Don't what? Lucien's gun didn't waver. Don't give him what he wants. Volkov pressed the gun harder against her skull. Shut up! Shoot him, Serafina said, louder now. He's going to kill me anyway. Serafina, do it. And in that moment, Lucien understood. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to trust her. Lucien's finger tightened on the trigger, and Serafina moved. She threw her weight backward, slamming her head into Volkov's chest, throwing off his aim. The Russian's gun went off, the shot going wide, and Lucien fired twice. Both bullets found their target. Volkov staggered, blood blooming across his chest, and collapsed. Lucien was across the room in seconds, cutting Serafina's bonds, pulling her into his arms. She was shaking, gasping, but alive. "You're insane," Lucien breathed. "I know." She clung to him, fingers digging into his jacket. "I know." Behind them, Volkov coughed blood. "This doesn't end." Lucien looked back at him, and his expression was stone. "Yes, it does." He raised his gun and fired one last time. Silence settled over the warehouse like snow. Lucien held Serafina, felt her heartbeat against his chest, and realized the terrifying truth. He'd just declared war on everyone, and there was no going back. The drive back to Manhattan was silent except for the sound of Serafina's breathing, shallow, uneven, alive. Lucien kept one hand on the wheel and the other on her knee, grounding himself in the reality that she was here, that he'd gotten to her in time. Her clothes were torn, face bruised, dried blood crusting the corner of her mouth. She stared out the window at the city passing by like she was seeing it for the first time. Or the last. Matteo had taken care of the cleanup. The bodies, the warehouse, the evidence. By the time the sun fully rose, Pier 7 would look like nothing had happened there except rust and time. But Lucien knew better. Blood had a way of seeping into concrete, leaving stains that never fully disappeared. "You should have waited for a backup," Serafina said finally. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "I don't wait. You could have died." "So could you." Lucien's jaw tightened. That wasn't an option. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't read. Gratitude, maybe, or anger that he'd risked everything for her. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why come for me?" She shifted in her seat, wincing. "We're not real. This marriage is a contract. You said it yourself. No attachments, no feelings, just business." Lucien didn't answer right away. Couldn't. Because the truth was lodged in his throat like broken glass, and saying it out loud would change everything. So instead he said, "You're my wife. That makes you my responsibility." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Serafina stared at him for a long moment, then turned back to the window. "You're a terrible liar." They reached the penthouse just as the city started waking up. Coffee shops opening, people stumbling towards subways, lives resuming like the world hadn't almost ended 6 hours ago. Lucien helped Serafina out of the car, steadied her when she swayed, and guided her into the elevator. She leaned against the wall, eyes closed, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical pain. Inside the penthouse, Lucien led her to the couch and disappeared into the bathroom. He came back with the first aid kit, warm water, clean towels. Serafina watched him in silence as he knelt in front of her and began cleaning the cuts on her face with a gentleness that didn't match his reputation. "They didn't..." Lucien's voice broke. He cleared his throat, started again. "Did they..." "No." Serafina caught his wrist, stopping him. "They hit me, tied me up, asked questions about you, but they didn't. They didn't touch me like that." Relief flooded through Lucien so intensely it hurt. He nodded, continued cleaning her wounds, his hands steadier now. "What questions?" "About your operations, your connections. How much you knew about Antonio's network." She flinched when he touched a particularly bad bruise. "I didn't tell them anything. I wouldn't have blamed you if you did." "I know." She studied his face, the concentration in his expression, the way his fingers trembled slightly despite his best efforts to hide it. "That's why I didn't." Lucien finished bandaging her cuts and sat back on his heels. For a moment they just looked at each other, two people who'd started as strangers, become enemies, and somewhere along the way turned into something neither of them had words for. "You should rest," Lucien said finally. "I can't." Serafina shook her head. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that warehouse. That'll fade. Will it? She laughed bitterly. You would know. Lucien stood up, grabbed a blanket from the closet, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he sat down beside her, close enough that their legs touched. It fades, he said quietly. But it doesn't disappear. You just learn to live with the ghost. Serafina pulled the blanket tighter. How many do you have? Too many to count. They sat in silence as morning light filtered through the windows, painting the penthouse in shades of gold and gray. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to their violence, their fear, their survival. Eventually, Serafina's breathing evened out, and her head dropped onto Lucien's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't dare, just sat there holding her while she finally slept. And for the first time in years, Lucien felt something other than emptiness. He felt terrified. The call came 3 hours later. Lucien had moved to his office, leaving Serafina asleep on the couch, and was going through the ledger he'd taken from Volkov's club when his phone buzzed. Antonio's name flashed across the screen. Lucien answered. What? We need to talk. Antonio's voice was flat, controlled. Now. I'm busy. I don't care. You've got 20 minutes to get to my estate, or I'm coming to you. The line went dead. Lucien stared at the phone, then looked toward the living room where Serafina was still sleeping. He didn't want to leave her, didn't want to let her out of his sight. But Antonio wasn't the type to make empty threats, and the last thing Lucien needed was a war on two fronts. He grabbed his jacket, checked his gun, and left. The drive to Staten Island felt longer than it should have. Traffic was heavy, and Lucien's mind was racing through every possible reason Antonio would call an emergency meeting 12 hours after Lucien had massacred half of Volkov's operation. None of the scenarios ended well. When he arrived, the gates were already open. Guards waved him through without checking weapons. That should have been the first warning. Inside, Antonio was waiting in the same office where they'd argued the night before, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 men stood behind him, enforcers, muscle, the kind of men who specialized in making people disappear. And sitting in the chair across from Antonio's desk was someone Lucien hadn't expected to see. Dmitri. Volkov's second in command, the man who'd been standing beside the Russian during their meeting in Red Hook. Lucien's hand moved toward his gun. Don't. Antonio's voice was sharp. Sit down. What is this? Sit. Down. Lucien sat, but his eyes never left Dmitri. The Russian looked calm, almost bored, like he was waiting for a bus instead of sitting in the office of a rival crime lord. Antonio leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You killed Viktor Volkov last night. He took my wife. And you burned 3 of his locations, killed 22 of his men, and caused approximately $40 million in damage to operations that were partially financed by me. Lucien's jaw clenched. You didn't tell me you were in business with Volkov. I didn't tell you a lot of things. Antonio gestured to Dmitri, including the fact that Victor and I had an arrangement. He moved product through my ports, and I got a cut. You marrying Serafina was supposed to make that partnership stronger, give me a direct line into your Manhattan operations while maintaining the Russian connection. So this was never about an alliance. It was always about an alliance. Antonio's expression hardened, just not the one you thought. Lucien felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything he'd believed about the marriage, about Antonio's motives, about the power structure he thought he understood. It was all a lie. You set me up. I gave you an opportunity. Antonio stood up, walked around the desk. You were supposed to integrate into the family, keep your head down, and help us expand. Instead, you started a war. Volkov started it when he took Serafina. Did he? Antonio stopped in front of Lucien, looking down at him with something like pity. Or did you start it the moment you decided my daughter was more important than business? The words hit like a physical blow. Lucien's hands clenched into fists. Where's this going, Antonio? It's going exactly where it was always going to go. Antonio nodded to Dmitri. Tell him. Dmitri leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and smiled. Victor didn't take your wife on his own initiative. He took her because Antonio asked him to. The room went silent. Lucien stared at Antonio, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't find words, couldn't process what he was hearing. What? It was a test. Antonio said calmly. To see what you cared about more, power or Serafina. To see if you'd be willing to negotiate, to compromise, to put the family's interests above your own ego. You used your own daughter as bait. I used a resource to assess a liability. Antonio's voice didn't waver. And you failed. Instead of negotiating, you burned everything to the ground. Instead of thinking strategically, you acted like a lovesick fool. Lucien stood up slowly, every muscle in his body coiled tight. You put her in danger. You let them beat her, terrorize her, make her think she was going to die. And she's fine. Antonio's eyes were cold. A few bruises, some fear. She'll recover. But you've destroyed months of planning, cost me millions in lost revenue, and made me look weak in front of every family from here to Boston. Then we're done. Lucien turned toward the door. We're not done until I say we're done. Lucien stopped, looked back. You want to stop me? Try. Antonio smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd already won. I don't need to stop you. You're going to stop yourself. What the hell does that mean? It means Serafina knows. Lucien's blood went cold. Knows what? Everything. Antonio walked back to his desk, pulled out a folder, and tossed it across the surface. Photographs spilled out, images of Lucien years ago, younger and hungrier, images of bodies, of crime scenes, of the things he'd done before he became the king of Manhattan. She knows about the Castellano family, about the prosecutor you had killed, about the witness who disappeared before the grand jury could convene. Lucien's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. You showed her this? I didn't have to. She found them herself. Antonio sat down, looking pleased with himself. Turns out my daughter is smarter than both of us. She's been investigating you since the day you got married, pulling records, talking to people, putting pieces together. And last night, while you were out playing hero, she called me, told me everything she'd found, asked me what kind of man she'd married. And what did you tell her? The truth. Antonio's smile widened. That you're a monster, that you've killed more people than you can remember, that you'll never be anything other than what you are, a criminal who destroys everything he touches. Lucien felt like he'd been shot, like someone had reached into his chest and torn out everything that kept him standing. Because the worst part, the part that made him want to burn the world down, was that Antonio was right. Where is she? Lucien's voice was barely a whisper. Safe, far away from you. Antonio leaned back. She asked me to annul the marriage, said she'd rather die than spend another day with you. The words hung in the air like poison. Lucien looked at Antonio, at Dimitri, at the enforcer standing ready to kill him if he made the wrong move. He thought about Serafina on the couch, sleeping with her head on his shoulder. Thought about the way she'd looked at him in the warehouse, trusting him to save her. Thought about how all of it had been a lie. So what now? Lucien asked. You kill me? No? Antonio stood up. Killing you would be too easy, and it would make Serafina ask questions I don't want to answer. So instead, you're going to walk away, sign the divorce papers, transfer your Brooklyn operations to me, and disappear. And if I don't, then I'll make sure every prosecutor, every Fed, every cop in this city gets a copy of that file. You'll be in prison within a week. And Serafina? Antonio's smile turned cruel. She'll testify against you herself. Lucien's world narrowed to a single point. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, everything he'd believed, it was all collapsing. And the worst part was knowing that he'd brought it on himself. That the moment he'd started caring about Serafina, he'd handed Antonio the only weapon that could destroy him. I need to talk to her, Lucien said. No. Antonio, she doesn't want to see you. Antonio walked to the door, opened it. Go home, Lucien, pack your things. The lawyers will be in touch. Lucien stood there, torn between rage and grief, between the instinct to fight and the knowledge that fighting would only hurt Serafina more. Finally, he walked to the door, stopped beside Antonio, and spoke quietly enough that only the older man could hear. If you're lying, if you hurt her, I'll kill you. I don't care what it costs me. Antonio's expression didn't change. She's my daughter. I would never hurt her. You already did. Lucien walked out, got in his car, and drove. He didn't go back to the penthouse. Couldn't face the emptiness, the ghost of Serafina's presence in every room. Instead, He drove to the warehouse in Brooklyn where his crew operated, pulled into the back lot, and sat in the darkness. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. "It's me. Don't call. Don't text back. Just listen." Lucien's heart stopped. Another message appeared. "My father lied. I didn't ask for an annulment. I didn't tell him I wanted to leave you. But he showed me the file, showed me who you were before we met. And I need to know. Is it true? Did you kill all those people?" Lucien stared at the screen, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say, because the answer was yes. He had killed those people. He'd done worse things than what was in that file. He'd built his empire on blood and terror, and there was no apology big enough to cover that. His fingers moved across the screen. Yes. The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, why? Lucien closed his eyes. Thought about the boy he used to be, hungry, angry, desperate to prove he was more than the poverty and violence that surrounded him. Thought about the first man he'd killed, the way it had felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. Because I didn't know how to survive any other way. The response came faster this time. And now? Now I'm trying to figure out how to survive without you. Silence. No dots. No response. Just the empty void of waiting. Then, finally, meet me. Tomorrow night. The place where we got married. Come alone. Lucien's hands were shaking. He typed back, "Why?" "Because I need to see your face when I decide whether to forgive you or destroy you." The messages stopped. Lucien sat in the darkness, phone clutched in his hand, and felt something crack open inside him, something raw and terrified and desperate. He'd faced down rival gangs, corrupt cops, federal investigations. He'd survived assassination attempts, betrayals, wars that should have killed him. But this, facing Serafina and seeing disgust in her eyes where there used to be something else, this might finally be the thing that broke him. The next 24 hours crawled by like years. Lucien stayed away from the penthouse, crashing at a safe house in Queens that smelled like mold and regret. He didn't sleep, couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Serafina in that warehouse, saw the moment she'd asked him to trust her, saw the way she'd looked at him after like he was something worth saving. And then he saw her reading that file, learning the truth about the man she'd married. By the time evening came, Lucien felt hollowed out. He put on the same suit he'd worn to their wedding. Dark, expensive, armor against the world. Checked his gun out of habit, then left it behind. If Serafina wanted him dead, he wouldn't stop her. The venue was exactly as he remembered it. Old stone, stained glass windows, now dark. Heavy wooden doors that creaked when he pushed them open. Inside, it was cold and empty, lit only by a few scattered candles someone had placed along the aisle. Serafina stood at the front, exactly where they'd said their vows. She wore black this time, a simple dress that made her look like she was mourning something. Her hair was pulled back, face still bruised but healing. She didn't smile when Lucien walked toward her, didn't move, just watched him approach with eyes that gave nothing away. Lucien stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into her features, far enough to give her space if she needed it. "You came," she said. "You asked me to." "I wasn't sure you would." She crossed her arms, a defensive posture that made Lucien's chest ache. "My father said you'd already left the city. Your father's a liar. So are you." The words hit like bullets. Lucien didn't flinch. "I never lied to you." "You never told me the truth." Serafina's voice was sharp, controlled. "You let me believe you were just a businessman who got his hands dirty sometimes. You let me think the violence was necessity, not nature." "It is necessity." "Bullshit." She stepped closer, anger flashing in her eyes. "You killed a prosecutor who was investigating organized crime. You murdered a witness before they could testify. You've orchestrated hits on rivals, on informants, on anyone who got in your way. That's not survival, Lucien. That's brutality." "You think you're any different?" Lucien's voice rose. "You're Antonio Arden's daughter. You grew up in this world. You know how it works." "I know how it works." Serafina's jaw tightened. "But I never pretended to be anything other than what I am. You made me believe there was something human underneath the monster." "There is." "Is there?" She laughed bitterly. "Because from where I'm standing, All I see is a man who's so scared of being vulnerable that he'd rather drown in blood than admit he feels something real. Lucien's hands clenched into fists. You want real? Fine. I feel terrified every time you walk out the door. I feel rage when someone threatens you. I feel like I'm suffocating when you're not around, and I don't know how to make it stop. That's not love, Serafina whispered. That's obsession. Then what's the difference? Love means you'd let me go if it was best for me. Her eyes were wet now, tears threatening to spill. Obsession means you'd burn the world down to keep me. Lucien stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, see the way her breath hitched. And which one do you want? Serafina stared at him, and for a moment Lucien thought she might walk away, might leave him standing there in the ruins of everything they'd almost become. Instead, she said, I want you to choose. Choose what? The Empire or me? Her voice was steady now, certain. Because you can't have both. As long as you're building kingdoms on corpses, people like Volkov will keep coming. My father will keep using me as leverage, and eventually someone's going to succeed in taking me from you. So you want me to walk away from everything I've built. I want you to decide what matters more. Serafina reached up, touched his face gently. Power that keeps you isolated and afraid? Or a life that might actually be worth living? Lucien caught her wrist, held it against his cheek. You're asking me to become someone I'm not. I'm asking you to become someone you could be. She leaned closer, close enough that their foreheads almost touched. I saw the file, Lucien. I know what you've done. And you want to know the terrifying truth? I don't care. I should. I should run as far from you as possible. But I can't. Because somewhere in the middle of this disaster, I fell in love with the man you are when you're not trying to be a king. The confession hit Lucien like a physical blow. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Serafina. But I won't stay if you choose the Empire. Her voice broke. I won't sit in that penthouse waiting for the day someone uses me to destroy you. So decide. Right now. Choose. Lucien stood there, trembling, caught between the only two things he'd ever cared about. The Empire had given him power, respect, safety. It had turned him from nothing into something feared and untouchable. But Serafina had given him something the Empire never could. She'd made him feel human. Before he could answer, the doors behind them slammed open. Lucien spun around, instinct kicking in, and saw Antonio standing in the entrance flanked by a dozen armed men. Behind them, more figures emerged from the shadows. Dmitri, and what looked like the remainder of Volkov's organization. Antonio walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately, a man who'd already won and was just enjoying the show. I'm disappointed, Serafina. I told you to stay away from him. And I told you I make my own choices. Serafina stepped beside Lucien, shoulder to shoulder. What is this? This is a reckoning. Antonio stopped 10 feet away. Lucien's little rampage last night cost both me and Dmitri a fortune. The only way to make peace with the other families is to give them what they want. And what do they want? Lucien asked, though he already knew the answer. You. Antonio's expression was cold. Your death ends the war. Dmitri takes over your Manhattan operations. I keep Brooklyn. Everyone wins. Except me. You stopped being relevant the moment you put my daughter before business. Serafina's hand found Lucien, squeezed hard. You can't do this. I can. Antonio looked at her with something like regret. And I am. You'll understand one day. Family requires sacrifice. Family? Serafina's voice was filled with venom. You used me as bait. You terrorized me to prove a point. You're not my family. You're a coward hiding behind the word. Antonio's jaw tightened. Take them both. The men moved forward, guns raised. Lucien pushed Serafina behind him, calculating odds, escape routes, how many he could take down before they killed him. The math was bad. Really bad. Then Serafina did something Lucien didn't expect. She pulled out a phone, not hers, someone else's, and held it up. Stop. Antonio frowned. What are you doing? Insurance. She tapped the screen and suddenly her voice filled the space, a recording, clear and damning. Antonio's voice followed, admitting to ordering Serafina's kidnapping, detailing his partnership with Volkov, outlining crimes that would put him away for life. I recorded our conversation yesterday, Serafina said calmly. Every word. And if anything happens to either of us, this recording goes to the FBI, the NYPD, and every major news outlet in the city. The warehouse went silent. Antonio stared at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. You wouldn't. Try me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Antonio laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You're more like me than I thought. No. Serafina's voice was ice. I'm nothing like you. Because when I betray someone, at least I have the decency to do it to their face. Antonio's expression hardened. He looked at Lucien, at Serafina, at the impossible situation his daughter had created. Finally, he lowered his hand, and his men lowered their weapons. You've just made yourself an enemy, Antonio said quietly. I've been your enemy since the day you sold me. Serafina took Lucien's hand. We're leaving. Don't follow us. Don't contact us. Consider the marriage annulled, the alliance dissolved. You'll never see me again. She turned, pulling Lucien with her, and walked toward the doors. They were almost there when Antonio's voice stopped them one last time. He'll destroy you, Serafina. Men like him always do. Serafina looked back, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd finally stopped being afraid. Then I'll destroy him first. They walked out into the night, leaving behind the families, the threats, the empire that had defined both their lives. And for the first time, neither of them knew what came next. But at least they'd face it together. They made it 3 blocks before the first shots rang out. Lucien shoved Serafina behind a parked car as bullets tore through the night air, shattering windows and sparking off metal. He pulled his backup piece, a compact 9mm he kept strapped to his ankle, and returned fire without looking, buying them seconds they didn't have. How many? Serafina's voice was steady despite the chaos, despite the fact that her father had just tried to execute them both. Too many. Lucien grabbed her hand. Run. They sprinted through the alley behind the venue, footsteps echoing off brick walls, gunfire pursuing them like a thunderstorm they couldn't outrun. Lucien's mind was racing through options, escape routes, safe houses that might not be compromised. Every choice felt like a trap waiting to spring. They emerged onto a side street where Lucien had left a car, one of his backup vehicles, unmarked, untraceable. He yanked open the door, pushed Serafina inside, and had the engine roaring before she'd even buckled her seatbelt. 2 of Antonio's men rounded the corner, weapons raised. Lucien floored the accelerator, and the car surged forward, clipping one of the men and sending him sprawling. The second dove out of the way, got off 3 shots that spiderwebbed the rear window, but didn't penetrate. Where are we going? Serafina asked, gripping the dashboard as Lucien took a corner hard enough to make the tires scream. Away from here. That's not a plan. It's the only plan we've got. Lucien's phone was buzzing continuously. Matteo probably, or one of his crew trying to figure out where the hell he was and why Antonio's people were tearing up Staten Island looking for him. He ignored it. Right now, everyone was a potential threat. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. They drove through the city for 20 minutes, taking random turns, doubling back, making sure no one was following. Finally, Lucien pulled into an underground garage in the Bronx, one he'd rented under a fake name years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. The silence after he killed the engine was deafening. Serafina sat there, breathing hard, staring at her hands like she couldn't quite believe what they'd just survived. He really tried to kill us. He tried to kill me. You were collateral damage. Same thing. She looked at him, and there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, but recognition. The kind that came when you finally saw the world clearly and realized how ugly it really was. What do we do now? Lucien leaned back, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical. We disappear. New identities, new city. Leave all of this behind. Run. Survive. Serafina was quiet for a long moment. Then she shook her head. No. No? We don't run. She turned to face him fully. If we run, they win. Antonio, Dimitri, every family in this city, they'll think they scared us off. And worse, they'll come after us eventually. You know they will. Men like them don't let threats walk away. So what's your alternative? We fight. Her voice was hard now, certain. We burn down everything they've built. We expose them, destroy their operations, turn their allies against them. We make it so they can't come after us because they're too busy trying to save themselves. Lucien stared at her. That's suicide. So is running. Serafina leaned closer. You spent your whole life building an empire. You know how these systems work, where the weak points are, who's loyal, and who's just pretending. Use that. Teach me. And together we'll tear them apart from the inside. You're talking about going to war with your own father. He stopped being my father the moment he used me as bait. Her eyes blazed. I'm done being a piece on someone else's board. If we're going to survive this, we survive it on our terms. Lucien saw something in her face then that he recognized. The same hunger he'd felt at 16 when he decided he'd rather die fighting than live on his knees. It was dangerous, reckless, the kind of decision that got people killed. It was also the only real choice they had. All right, Lucien pulled out his phone. But we do this smart. No rushing in. No emotional mistakes. We treat this like war because that's what it is. What's the first move? Lucien thought for a moment, mentally mapping the power structure Antonio had built. We cut off his money. Without cash flow, he can't pay his people, can't maintain alliances, can't operate. And I know exactly where he keeps his reserves. Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd finally stopped playing defense. Then let's go take it. The next 12 hours were a blur of preparation. Lucien made calls to people he trusted, a short list that got shorter every year, and pulled together a crew. Not his usual people. Those were compromised, probably already being leaned on by Antonio or picked up by Dimitri. Instead, he reached out to ghosts. Men who'd left the life, who owed him favors, who were crazy or desperate enough to take on a suicide mission for the right price. By dawn, they had 8 people in a warehouse in Queens. Lucien spread out blueprints across a table, schematics of a building in Midtown that looked like a corporate office but functioned as Antonio's main counting house. Millions of dollars moved through there every week, laundered through shell companies and fake investments. Security's tight, Lucien explained, pointing to marked positions on the blueprint. 4 guards on the ground floor, 2 in the elevator, 3 on the floor where the money's kept. Cameras everywhere. Reinforced doors, panic buttons that alert a response team within 90 seconds. One of the crew, a wiry man named Santos who'd done time for armed robbery, whistled low. That's a fortress. It's supposed to be. Lucien looked up. Which is why we're not going through the front door. He indicated a spot on the roof. Building next door is under construction. We access the roof there, cross over, and cut through from above. Avoid the cameras, avoid the guards, get to the money before anyone knows we're there. And getting out? Santos asked. That's the hard part. Lucien pulled out another map, this one showing the street surrounding the building. We'll have maybe 3 minutes before the response team arrives. We need vehicles staged here, here, and here. 3 escape routes. If one gets blocked, we use another. Serafina stood beside him, studying the plans with an intensity that surprised him. She'd changed clothes, dark jeans, boots, a leather jacket that made her look dangerous. Her hair was pulled back, face cleaned of makeup. She looked like someone ready for war. What about surveillance? She asked. They'll have footage. I've got someone wiping the feeds remotely. Lucien glanced at her. But faces covered anyway. No chances. And if something goes wrong? Then we improvise. Santos laughed. That's not much of a plan. It's the best we've got. Lucien straightened up, looked around at the assembled crew. Anyone wants out, now's the time. Once we start this, there's no stopping. We're burning bridges we can't rebuild. No one moved. Good. Lucien checked his watch. We move at 10 tonight. Get some rest. It's going to be a long night. The crew dispersed, leaving Lucien and Serafina alone in the warehouse. She walked over to the windows, stared out at the city waking up, and Lucien saw tension in every line of her body. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I can handle it with the crew. I'm doing it. Serafina? I said I'm doing it. She turned to face him. You think I'm scared? I think you're smart enough to be scared. I am scared. She crossed the distance between them. I'm terrified, but I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life running, looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment they find us. So yeah, I'm doing this, and you're not going to stop me. Lucien reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. If something happens to you, then you keep going. She caught his hand, pressed it against her cheek. You don't stop. You don't give up. You finish what we started. That's not... Promise me. Her eyes were fierce. Promise me that if I don't make it, you'll burn them all down anyway. Lucien pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, and felt her heartbeat against his chest. Nothing's going to happen to you. You can't promise that. Watch me. They stood there holding each other as morning light filtered through the dirty windows. Two people who'd started as enemies and become something neither of them had words for. Something worth dying for. Something worth killing for. At 9:30 that night, they assembled on the roof of the construction site. The city stretched out beneath them, a sea of lights and sirens and lives being lived by people who had no idea what was about to happen. Lucien checked his equipment one last time. Rope, harness, suppressed pistol, flashlight, lockpicks. Everything he needed to ghost through a building and disappear with enough money to cripple Antonio's operation. Serafina stood beside him, similarly equipped, face hidden behind a black mask. Only her eyes were visible, and they were steady, focused. "Ready?" Lucien asked. "Ready." They crossed to the adjacent building, moving silently across a narrow gap between rooftops. The counting house was below them now, quiet and dark except for a few lit windows. Lucien found the access point he'd identified earlier, a ventilation shaft that led down to the third floor. "This is it," he whispered. "Once we're inside, no talking unless necessary. Hand signals only." Serafina nodded. They descended into darkness, the shaft barely wide enough for their shoulders, metal groaning under their weight. Lucien went first, feeling his way down, counting the floors by memory. When he reached the right level, he paused, listening. Silence. He cut through the grating with a small saw, working slowly to minimize noise. It took 10 minutes that felt like hours. Finally, the grating came free, and Lucien lowered himself into a dark hallway. Serafina dropped down beside him a moment later, landing silently. They were in. The hallway was empty, lit only by emergency exit signs that cast everything in shades of red. Lucien checked his mental map, oriented himself, and moved toward the secure room where Antonio kept his cash reserves. 3 doors down, 2 locked, one with a biometric scanner. This was where it got complicated. Lucien pulled out a small device, military-grade bypass tech he'd acquired from a contact who specialized in this kind of work. He attached it to the scanner, and it went to work, cycling through possible combinations at impossible speeds. 30 seconds. 45. A full minute. Behind them, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Lucien's hand moved to his gun. Serafina pressed herself against the wall, invisible in the shadows. The footsteps grew closer, and Lucien could see a flashlight beam sweeping the hallway. The device beeped. The lock disengaged. Lucien grabbed Serafina and pulled her through the door, closing it silently just as the guard rounded the corner. They stood in absolute darkness, holding their breath, listening to the guard's footsteps pass by and fade into the distance. "That was close," Serafina whispered. "Too close." Lucien turned on his flashlight, keeping the beam low. They were in the counting room, a space about the size of a small apartment, lined with metal shelves holding canvas bags. Cash. Lots of it. Lucien grabbed a duffel bag from his pack and started filling it, working fast and methodical. Serafina did the same, and within 5 minutes they'd loaded 4 bags with close to $2 million in unmarked bills. "This is going to hurt him," Serafina said, hefting one of the bags. "This is going to cripple him." Lucien slung 2 bags over his shoulders. "Let's move." They retraced their steps, moving back toward the ventilation shaft. Everything was going according to plan. Too smoothly. Lucien's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but he couldn't see what. They reached the shaft, and Lucien was about to climb up when the lights came on, every light in the building, all at once. And then the alarm started screaming. "Move!" Lucien shoved Serafina toward the shaft. She scrambled up, bags slowing her down, and Lucien followed, his heart slamming against his ribs. Below them, he could hear doors opening, voices shouting, footsteps pounding. They'd been made. They reached the roof just as the response team burst through the stairwell door. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off metal. Lucien returned fire while running, giving Serafina time to cross back to the construction site. He followed, legs pumping, lungs burning. They made it to the edge of the roof, and Lucien looked down. Their escape vehicle was 3 floors below, parked in an alley. They had rope, but not enough time to rappel down properly. "Jump," Lucien said. Serafina stared at him. "That's a 30-foot drop." "There's a dumpster." "Are you insane?" "Probably." Lucien grabbed her hand. "On 3. 1, more gunfire. Closer now. 2. The response team was on the roof. 3. They jumped. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. Wind rushing past, stomach dropping, the ground rushing up to meet them. They hit the dumpster hard, bags cushioning some of the impact, but not enough. Pain exploded through Lucien's shoulder, and he heard Serafina cry out. But they were alive. Lucien rolled out of the dumpster, pulled Serafina after him, and they ran for the car. Santos was behind the wheel, engine running, and he peeled out the moment they were inside. "That was messy," Santos said, taking a corner at 60 miles an hour. "It worked." Lucien checked Serafina. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, clutching her ribs, but her eyes were still focused, still fighting. "You okay?" he asked. "I will be." She looked at the bags of cash. "Did we get enough?" "More than enough." They drove through the city, switching vehicles twice, taking routes designed to lose anyone following them. By the time they reached the safe house in the Bronx, it was past midnight and Lucien's entire body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. Inside, he dumped the cash on a table and started counting. 2.3 million. Not enough to destroy Antonio completely, but enough to hurt, enough to send a message. Serafina collapsed onto a couch, wincing. "What's next?" "Next we hit his supply lines, then his political connections, then his street operations." Lucien sat down beside her. "We systematically dismantle everything he's built until there's nothing left." "How long will that take?" "Weeks, maybe a month." "And if he comes after us?" "He will." Lucien looked at her. "This was just the opening move. He's going to hit back hard." "Good." Serafina's eyes were cold. "Let him come. I'm done being afraid of my father." As if on cue, Lucien's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You've made a grave mistake." Lucien showed it to Serafina. She read it, then typed a response on his phone and hit send before he could stop her. "Come find out how big." Lucien stared at her. "You just declared war." "I declared war the moment I walked out of that building." She stood up, ignoring the pain in her ribs. "Now, let's finish what we started." The next 2 weeks were a campaign of calculated destruction. Lucien used every contact, every piece of leverage, every dirty secret he'd accumulated over the years to systematically dismantle Antonio's empire. They hit 3 more cash houses, stealing over $8 million. They leaked information to the feds about shipping routes, leading to the seizure of 2 major drug shipments. They anonymously tipped off rival families about weaknesses in Antonio's territory, sparking conflicts that forced him to divert resources. And through it all, Antonio's people came after them. 3 assassination attempts in the first week alone. A car bomb that Lucien spotted 30 seconds before it detonated. A sniper that Serafina saw reflecting in a window and dove away from just in time. A home invasion at one of their safe houses that turned into a firefight Lucien barely survived. They were living on borrowed time, and everyone knew it. But they kept pushing, kept hitting Antonio where it hurt, kept proving that they weren't going to disappear quietly. On the 14th day, Matteo finally made contact. They met in a parking garage downtown, both of them armed, both of them paranoid. Matteo looked like he'd aged 10 years, gaunt, exhausted, jumpy. "Boss, this has to stop," he said immediately. "Antonio's losing his mind. He's putting bounties on both of you, 2 million each, dead or alive." "Let him." Lucien's voice was flat. "We're not stopping." "You're going to get yourselves killed." "Then we'll die fighting." Matteo grabbed Lucien's arm. "Listen to me. I've been loyal to you for 15 years. I followed you through wars, investigations, near-death situations I can't even count. But this is different. You're not fighting to build something anymore. You're fighting to destroy, and that kind of war doesn't end until everyone's dead. Maybe that's what needs to happen." "And her?" Matteo gestured toward where Serafina was waiting in the car. "You're dragging her down with you?" "She's not being dragged. She's choosing this. Because she loves you." Matteo's voice dropped. "But love doesn't stop bullets, boss." It doesn't prevent her from ending up in a body bag. Is that what you want? Lucien's jaw clenched. What do you want me to do, Matteo? Walk away? Let Antonio win? I want you to survive. Matteo looked exhausted. I want both of you to survive. So I'm giving you a way out. What way out? Matteo pulled out a folder, handed it over. Inside were documents, bank accounts, property deeds, offshore holdings. This is everything you stole from Antonio, plus some of my own savings. It's enough to disappear for real. New identities, new country. You could be gone by tomorrow and no one would ever find you. Lucien stared at the documents. You'd do that? You're like a brother to me. Matteo's eyes were wet. So yeah, I'd do that. For a moment, Lucien was tempted, really tempted. The idea of taking Serafina somewhere safe, somewhere far from the violence and blood, somewhere they could actually try to build a life, it was seductive. But then he thought about Antonio sitting in his estate, believing he'd won, believing he could terrorize his own daughter and face no consequences, believing that power and fear were enough to control everything. I appreciate this, Lucien said quietly, handing back the folder. But I can't. Boss, he crossed a line, Matteo. He used Serafina as bait. He tried to have us both killed, and if I run now, he'll just do it to someone else. Another daughter, another wife, another person who trusted him. So this is about justice? This is about making sure he can't hurt anyone else. Matteo stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then I'm with you. You don't have to go. I'm with you. Matteo's voice was firm, until the end, whatever that looks like. Lucien felt something break open in his chest. Gratitude, relief, the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying everything alone finally lifting slightly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Matteo pulled out his phone. Because I've got intel you need. Antonio's planning something big, a meeting with all the major families tomorrow night. He's trying to unite them against you, pool resources for one final push. Where? His estate, Staten Island. Lucien's mind was already racing. How many people? 20, maybe 30. All the major players. Matteo hesitated. Boss, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I'm going to end this. Lucien's voice was cold. Tomorrow night, one way or another. They spent the next 24 hours preparing for what would either be their greatest victory or their final stand. Lucien reached out to the few allies he had left, people who hated Antonio more than they feared him, people who'd been waiting for someone crazy enough to make a move. By the time night fell, they had a crew of 15. Not enough to storm Antonio's estate head-on, but enough to cause chaos if they were smart about it. Serafina checked her weapon, a compact pistol Lucien had taught her to use over the past 2 weeks, and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much violence for someone her age. This is it. This is it. If we don't make it, we'll make it. But if we don't, she stepped closer, pressed her forehead against his. I need you to know that these past few weeks, running with you, fighting beside you, they've been the most alive I've ever felt. Lucien's throat tightened. Serafina. I love you. The words came out fierce, certain. And whatever happens tonight, that's real. That's the one thing in this entire mess that's real. Lucien kissed her then, hard and desperate, tasting salt and fear and something that might have been hope. When they pulled apart, he said the words he'd been too afraid to admit. I love you too. They drove to Staten Island as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Antonio's estate loomed ahead, lit up like a fortress, surrounded by cars and guards, and the weight of decades of criminal power. Lucien parked a block away and looked at his crew. You all know the plan. We create distractions, force them outside, split their attention. Matteo's team hits the east entrance. Santos takes the west. Serafina and I go through the main gate. That's suicide, Santos said. Probably. Lucien chambered a round in his gun. But it's also the last thing they'll expect. They moved out in silence, shadows slipping through the night. Lucien's heart was pounding, adrenaline singing through his veins. This was it, the culmination of everything. Win or lose, live or die, it all came down to the next hour. They reached the main gate and Lucien didn't hesitate. He walked up to the guards like he belonged there, like he owned the ground beneath his feet. "I'm here to see Antonio," he said calmly. The guards raised their weapons. "Mr. Arden isn't seeing anyone." "He'll see me." One of the guards reached for his radio, and Lucien shot him. Center mass. Clean. The second guard went for his gun, and Serafina shot him first, her aim steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Alarms started screaming. The estate lit up like daylight, and Lucien and Serafina walked through the gates, side by side, weapons raised, ready to end this. Antonio's men poured out of the mansion, at least 20 of them, all armed and ready. Gunfire erupted, tearing through the night. Lucien dove behind a fountain, returning fire, watching as his crew engaged from multiple angles, creating the chaos they needed. Beside him, Serafina was calm, focused, every shot deliberate. She'd transformed over the past few weeks from a woman trapped in someone else's game into a fighter who chose her own battles. They fought their way through the courtyard, through the entrance hall, leaving bodies and blood in their wake. The mansion was a war zone, filled with smoke and screaming and the acrid smell of gunpowder. And then, finally, they reached Antonio's office. The door was open. Inside, Antonio sat behind his desk, flanked by Dimitri and two other enforcers. He looked calm, almost serene, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "I knew you'd come," Antonio said. "You're predictable, Lucien. You always have been." Lucien raised his gun. "It's over, Antonio." "Is it?" Antonio smiled. "Look around. My men outnumber yours. This estate is a fortress. You've walked into a trap thinking you were setting one." "Then kill us." Serafina's voice was steel. "Stop talking and do it." Antonio's smile faded. He looked at his daughter, and for the first time Lucien saw something like regret in the old man's eyes. "I didn't want it to come to this." "Yes, you did." Serafina stepped forward, gun steady. "This is who you are. This is who you've always been. A man who treats people like chess pieces and wonders why no one stays. I did everything for this family. You did everything for yourself." Her voice cracked. "And I'm done. I'm done being your daughter, done being your leverage, done pretending there's anything human left inside you." Antonio stood up slowly. "If you pull that trigger, you'll never be able to take it back." "I know." Father and daughter stared at each other across the desk, and Lucien saw the moment something shattered between them. Whatever fragile connection had survived years of manipulation and violence finally breaking for good. Serafina's finger tightened on the trigger, and Dimitri moved. He was fast, faster than Lucien expected, lunging for Serafina with a knife that appeared from nowhere. Lucien fired, hit Dimitri in the shoulder, but the Russian kept coming, blade flashing. Serafina twisted away, but not fast enough. The knife caught her across the arm, opening a line of red. She screamed, more in rage than pain, and shot Dimitri twice in the chest. He went down. Chaos erupted. The enforcers moved, guns coming up. Lucien shot one, tackled the other, grappled with him on the floor. From the hallway, Matteo burst in with Santos and three others, and suddenly the office was a massacre. Through it all, Antonio stood behind his desk, untouched, watching his empire collapse with the detachment of someone who'd already accepted the ending. When the smoke cleared, 6 bodies littered the floor. Lucien was standing, bleeding from a dozen cuts, breathing hard. Serafina was against the wall, clutching her wounded arm, but alive. Matteo and Santos covered the doors, weapons ready, and Antonio was still behind his desk. "It's over," Lucien said again, raising his gun. "No." Antonio's voice was quiet. "It's never over. You kill me, and someone else steps up. Dimitri had allies. I have partners across 6 states. This war will continue long after I'm dead, and it'll consume both of you." "Maybe." Lucien's hand didn't waver. "But at least you won't be around to see it." Antonio looked at Serafina one last time. "I'm sorry." "No, you're not." And she was right. Antonio wasn't sorry. He was just tired. Lucien pulled the trigger, and the world exploded. The gunshot echoed through the office like the closing of a tomb. Antonio's body jerked backward, hitting the leather chair, then slumping forward onto the desk. Blood spread across the mahogany surface, dark and final. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. They just stood there, surrounded by bodies and smoke and the weight of what they'd done. Serafina stared at her father's corpse, and Lucien watched her face cycle through emotions too complex to name: grief, relief, rage, emptiness. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stood there clutching her bleeding arm while the man who'd raised her bled out 10 feet away. "We need to move." Mateo's voice cut through the silence. "Response teams will be here in minutes." Lucien lowered his gun, crossed to Serafina, and gently took her uninjured hand. "Can you walk?" She nodded, but her eyes were still locked on Antonio. "Serafina." Lucien stepped into her line of sight, forcing her to look at him instead. "He's gone. We're not. We need to leave." Something in his voice broke through. She blinked, focused on his face, and the paralysis shattered. "Okay, let's go." They moved through the mansion like ghosts, stepping over bodies, past rooms that had witnessed decades of criminal enterprise and family dysfunction. Outside, sirens were converging from multiple directions. Police, probably, or what remained of Antonio's organization coming to investigate the carnage. Santos had 3 cars waiting. They split up, Mateo taking 5 of the crew in one direction, Santos and the others going another way. Lucien, Serafina, and 2 trusted men named Chen and Rodriguez took the 3rd route, heading north toward the Bronx. No one spoke during the drive. Serafina pressed a cloth against her arm to stop the bleeding, staring out the window at the city passing by. Lucien kept checking the mirrors, waiting for pursuit that never came. Maybe they'd gotten lucky. Maybe everyone was too busy trying to figure out what the hell had just happened to chase them yet. Or maybe the real consequences were still coming. They reached the safe house, a different one this time, in a part of the city no one would think to look, and Lucien immediately set to work patching Serafina's wound. The knife had cut deep but clean, missing anything vital. She sat on the bathroom counter while he stitched her up with steady hands that betrayed none of the chaos screaming inside his head. "Does it hurt?" he asked, tying off the last stitch. "Everything hurts." Her voice was hollow. "I killed my father tonight." "No, I killed your father." "We both did." She looked down at her hands, at the blood under her nails that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed. "I thought I'd feel different. Relieved, maybe. Or guilty. But I just feel empty." Lucien bandaged the wound carefully, then helped her down from the counter. "That's normal. The rest comes later." "How much later?" "Depends on the person." He led her to the bedroom, sat her down on the bed. "For some people, it never comes at all. They just learn to live in the emptiness." "Is that what you did?" Lucien thought about the first man he'd killed, the prosecutor, the witness, all the ghosts that followed him through the years. "I tried. Doesn't really work." Serafina lay back on the bed, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical. "What happens now? We won. Antonio's dead, Dimitri's dead, Volkov's organization is in pieces. So what's next? Now we figure out how to survive the aftermath. Will they come after us? Probably." Lucien sat beside her. Antonio had allies, partners, people who benefited from his operations. When they find out he's dead, they'll want answers, want revenge, want to fill the power vacuum. "So we're not safe. We're never safe." He looked at her, saw the woman who'd walked into his life 3 months ago as a contract bride and become the only thing he cared about protecting. "But we're alive. And as long as we're alive, we can keep fighting." Serafina reached up, touched his face gently. "I'm tired of fighting." "I know. I want to go somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knows our names or cares about empires and blood money. I want to wake up without checking for assassins. I want to fall asleep without counting exits." Her eyes were wet now, finally. "I want a life that isn't measured in how many days we survive." Lucien pressed his forehead against hers. "Then that's what we'll build." "Can we? After everything we've done? I don't know." He was being honest, because lies wouldn't help either of them anymore. "But we can try." They fell asleep like that, holding each other in a room that smelled like antiseptic and gunpowder. 2 people who'd burned down the world and were trying to figure out how to live in the ashes. The next morning, Lucien woke to find Serafina already up, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, staring at the city. She looked fragile in the morning light, something Lucien had never associated with her before. Fragile, but not broken. Just human. "Mateo called," she said without turning around. "The news is everywhere. Antonio Arden found dead in his estate along with 15 others. Police are calling it a gang war. The feds are launching investigations. Every family in New York is scrambling to figure out what this means for them. And us? No one said our names yet. She finally looked at him. Mateo thinks we have maybe 48 hours before someone puts it together. Lucien stood, crossed to her, and took the coffee from her hands. Then we use those 48 hours to disappear for real this time. Where would we go? West Coast, maybe further. I've got contacts in Vancouver who owe me favors. We could get new identities, set up somewhere quiet. And the money? The empire you built? I don't care about the empire anymore. Lucien set down the coffee, took both her hands in his. I care about you. About having a life that isn't defined by who we're running from or who we're trying to kill. If that means walking away from everything, then that's what we do. Serafina searched his face, looking for the lie, the hesitation, the part of him that would always choose power over peace. But Lucien had left that version of himself back in Antonio's office, bleeding out with all the other ghosts. Okay, she said finally. Let's disappear. They spent the next 2 days erasing themselves. Lucien liquidated what assets he could access, transferring money to offshore accounts that couldn't be traced. He called in every favor, burned every bridge that might lead back to them. Mateo agreed to take over what remained of the organization, with strict instructions to go legitimate as much as possible. No more drugs, no more violence, just the business operations that could survive scrutiny. You sure about this, boss? Mateo asked during their final phone call. Once you're gone, you can't come back. I'm sure. Lucien looked at Serafina packing the last of their supplies. Take care of the crew. And if anyone asks where we went, I never saw you. Mateo's voice was thick. Good luck out there. You too. The line went dead. Lucien stood there holding the phone, feeling the weight of 15 years of criminal enterprise evaporating like smoke. It should have hurt more. Should have felt like losing a limb. Instead, it felt like putting down a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. They left New York at dawn on the third day, driving a nondescript sedan with fake plates and documents that would hold up to casual inspection. Serafina sat in the passenger seat, watching the city shrink in the rearview mirror, and Lucien wondered if she was thinking about her father, about the home she'd grown up in, about everything they were leaving behind. Any regrets? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment, then, only that it took so long. They drove west, taking back roads and avoiding cameras, stopping at cheap motels where no one asked questions as long as cash was involved. It took them a week to reach the coast, and by the time they did, Lucien felt like they'd crossed into a different world. The air smelled like salt and pine instead of exhaust and decay. The sky was bigger, the silence less oppressive. Vancouver was cold and wet and perfect. Lucien's contact, a man named Wei who'd gotten out of the life 20 years ago, set them up with new documents, a small apartment near the water, and jobs that wouldn't draw attention. Serafina became Sarah Chen, a freelance graphic designer. Lucien became Michael Torres, a construction consultant. Nobody important, nobody dangerous, nobody at all. The first month was the hardest. Lucien kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to recognize them, for the past to come crashing through the door with guns and consequences. He checked locks obsessively, mapped escape routes from their apartment, kept a go-bag packed and ready. Serafina noticed, of course. She always noticed. We're safe here, she said one night, finding him staring out the window at 3 a.m. No one's coming. You don't know that. Neither do you. She pulled him away from the window, back to bed. But standing guard every night isn't living. It's just a different kind of prison. She was right. Lucien knew she was right. But knowing and accepting were different things. Slowly, though, the paranoia began to fade. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The news from New York grew distant. Investigations stalled. Criminal networks reorganized. Life moved on the way it always did when powerful men died. No one came looking for them. No one even seemed to care. Lucien started sleeping through the night, started walking to work without checking over his shoulder, started believing, cautiously, that they might actually pull this off. Serafina bloomed in the quiet. She took up painting, something she'd always wanted to try but never had time for. Her apartment filled with canvases depicting abstract violence slowly giving way to soft colors and gentle shapes. Lucien watched her transform from a woman perpetually braced for impact into someone who could laugh freely, who could relax, who could simply exist without calculation. 6 months after leaving New York, they got married again. Not for strategy or alliances or power, just for themselves. It was a small ceremony in a courthouse with Wei and his wife as witnesses. No guns, no guards, no enemies waiting to strike, just two people choosing each other in the wreckage of everything they'd destroyed to get here. You know the funny thing? Serafina said afterward, as they walked along the seawall watching boats drift across the harbor. This marriage feels more real than the first one ever did. That's because it is real. Lucien took her hand, no longer afraid of the vulnerability that came with caring. The first time we were playing roles. This time, we're just us. And who are we? I don't know yet. He pulled her closer. But I'm looking forward to finding out. They built a life that was small and ordinary and more valuable than any empire. Lucien worked construction, came home tired and sore in ways that felt earned rather than inflicted. Serafina sold her paintings at local galleries, slowly building a reputation under her new name. They had friends, real friends, people who didn't know about their past, who liked them for who they were now rather than who they'd been. On weekends, they explored the coast, hiked through rainforests, watched whales breach in the Pacific, ate seafood at restaurants where no one recognized them, and the only danger was food poisoning from bad oysters. It was boring. It was peaceful. It was everything they'd fought for without knowing it. A year after they'd left New York, Matteo sent a single encrypted message. The business is clean. The crew is safe. No one's looking for you anymore. You're free. Lucien read it 3 times, then deleted it and threw away the burner phone. The past was finally, truly behind them. That night, he found Serafina on their balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars. She'd started showing a few months ago, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking, but Lucien saw it every time he looked at her. Saw the future they were building in the curve of her stomach, in the way she rested her hand there protectively. Thinking about him? Lucien asked, sitting beside her. She didn't have to ask who he meant. Sometimes, not as much as I used to. Do you regret it? Killing him? She considered the question seriously. No. He would have kept hurting people, kept using them, kept believing that power justified everything. The world's better without him. That's cold. That's honest. She looked at him. Do you regret it? Lucien thought about Antonio's face in those final moments, about all the blood that had been spilled to get them here, about the empire he'd abandoned and the life he'd chosen instead. No, but I regret the cost. The people who died, the lines we crossed. We can't undo those things. I know. So what do we do with the guilt? We carry it. Lucien put his arm around her shoulders. We remember what we did, why we did it, and we make sure the life we're building now is worth what it cost to get here. Serafina leaned into him, and they sat there in the darkness, two people who'd destroyed everything to save each other, now trying to figure out how to deserve the peace they'd stolen. What should we name her? Serafina asked suddenly. Her? It's a girl. I found out yesterday. She smiled, and it was the first truly unguarded smile Lucien had seen from her. We're having a daughter. Lucien felt something crack open in his chest, terror and joy, an overwhelming responsibility all mixed together. A daughter, a tiny human who would depend on them completely, who would inherit whatever world they built for her. I don't know, something normal, something that won't make her stand out. Hope, Serafina said. I want to name her Hope. That's not normal. No, but it's honest. She took his hand, placed it on her stomach where he could feel the subtle swell of new life. Because that's what she is. Hope that we can be better than what we came from. Hope that violence doesn't have to define us forever. Hope that somewhere in the ruins of who we used to be, there's something worth saving. Lucien felt tears on his face and didn't bother hiding them. Hope, he repeated. Yeah, I like that. They sat there until the sun rose over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the promise of another day survived. Behind them, the apartment they'd built together waited. Small, safe, paid for, with money that was finally clean. Below them, the city stirred to life. full of people who would never know the violence required to purchase this peace. And inside Serafina, a heartbeat that didn't care about empires or blood debts or the sins of parents, only about growing toward the light. Lucien thought about the boy he used to be, hungry, angry, desperate to prove he was more than his circumstances. Thought about the man he'd become, feared, powerful, empty inside except for the violence that kept him moving forward. Thought about who he was now, someone's husband, soon to be someone's father, trying to figure out how to live without armor. "Do you think we can do this?" he asked quietly. "Raise a child? Be normal parents?" "Probably not," Serafina laughed softly. "But we can try, and maybe that's enough. What if the past catches up? Then we face it together." She turned to look at him, and her eyes held all the certainty he lacked. "We've survived wars, betrayals, assassination attempts. We've killed our way out of corners and built new lives from nothing. A baby? We can handle a baby." Lucien wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the violence they'd left behind was truly behind them, that they could be the kind of parents who didn't flinch at loud noises or teach their daughter escape routes before she could read, that they could be normal. But normal was a lie people told themselves to feel safe. And Lucien had learned a long time ago that safety was something you built with your own hands, defended with your own will, and fought for with everything you had. So instead of promising they'd be normal, he made a different promise. "I'll protect you both," he said. "Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, you and Hope will be safe." "I know," Serafina kissed him softly, "but you don't have to do it alone anymore. We protect each other. That's how this works now." Over the next 6 months, they prepared for Hope's arrival the way most parents did, assembling cribs, buying tiny clothes, reading books about childbirth and newborn care that made them both feel completely unprepared. But beneath the normal preparation, they also made other plans. Security systems for the apartment, emergency contacts in 3 different countries, a safety deposit box with enough cash and documents to disappear again if they had to, just in case. Hope was born on a rainy Tuesday in March, screaming her way into the world with the same fierce determination her mother had. Lucien held her for the first time and felt something he'd never experienced before. Absolute, unconditional terror that something might happen to this impossibly small person who depended on him completely. "She's perfect," Serafina said from the hospital bed, exhausted and radiant. "She's terrifying." Lucien couldn't stop staring at Hope's tiny face, her closed eyes, her fingers wrapped around his thumb. How do people do this? How do they love something this much and not lose their minds? "They don't," Serafina smiled. "They just learn to live with the fear." Hope opened her eyes, dark like her father's, curious like her mother's, and looked directly at Lucien. And in that moment, every empire he'd built, every person he'd killed, every line he'd crossed to become powerful, all of it shrank down to nothing compared to this. This was the only kingdom that mattered. They brought Hope home to the apartment that had become their sanctuary, and life shifted into a new rhythm. Sleepless nights and endless diapers and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from keeping another human alive. It was harder than running a criminal empire. More rewarding, too. Lucien discovered he was good at the routine parts, the feeding, the changing, the rocking. Hope to sleep at 3 in the morning while Serafina recovered. He'd spent his whole life imposing order on chaos, and babies were just another kind of chaos that needed managing. Serafina was good at the softer parts. The singing, the stories, the way she could calm Hope's crying with just her voice. She painted the nursery herself, covering the walls with gentle animals and soft colors, creating a world where violence didn't exist. Wei and his wife became surrogate grandparents, helping when the exhaustion became too much, never asking about the scars they saw or the way Lucien still checked locks obsessively. They'd been in the life once. They understood what it cost to get out. One night, when Hope was 3 months old, Lucien found himself standing over her crib, watching her sleep. She was so small, so vulnerable, so completely dependent on him to keep her safe from a world that had chewed him up and spit him out harder. "She'll be okay." Serafina appeared beside him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "We'll make sure of it." "How can you be so certain?" "Because we know what we're protecting her from." Serafina looked at their sleeping daughter. "We've lived through the worst parts of humanity. We know what power does to people, how violence spreads. why empires collapse, and we can teach her to be better than all of it. What if we can't? What if who we are, who we were, it's genetic? What if she inherits our darkness? Then we teach her how to live with it. Serafina's voice was firm. We don't lie to her about what we've done. We don't pretend we're saints, but we show her that people can change, that choosing differently is possible. Lucien pulled her closer. When did you get so wise? Around the time I realized I'd fallen in love with a murderer and decided to keep him anyway. She smiled up at him. We're all works in progress, Lucien. Even hope. Especially hope. And maybe that's the point. Not to be perfect, but to keep trying to be better. Years passed. Hope grew from an infant into a toddler, then a child who asked too many questions and inherited her mother's defiance and her father's intensity. They enrolled her in school under her fake name, threw birthday parties with normal kids who had normal parents, and slowly built the illusion that they were just another family making it work. The nightmares came less frequently. The paranoia faded to manageable background noise. Lucien stopped checking the news from New York obsessively, and Serafina stopped painting abstract violence altogether. They grew older, quieter, more settled. On Hope's 7th birthday, they took her to the ocean. She ran along the beach, chasing waves, laughing in a way that had no shadows behind it. Lucien and Serafina watched from the shore, holding hands, and Lucien felt the weight of everything they'd survived settle into something like gratitude. Do you ever miss it? Serafina asked. The power? The empire? Lucien thought about it honestly. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about what it felt like to walk into a room and have everyone go quiet, to make decisions that moved millions of dollars and hundreds of people, to be feared. But then I wake up next to you. I watch Hope eat breakfast and complain about homework. I go to work building things instead of destroying them, and I realize I don't miss it at all. He looked at her. I miss the certainty, maybe. The clarity of knowing exactly who I was and what I was capable of. But I don't miss the emptiness. I don't miss being the kind of man who measured worth in body counts. Good, Serafina squeezed his hand, because I like who you are now better. Who am I now? Someone who's learning to be human. She smiled. It's a good look on you. Hope ran back to them, soaking wet and covered in sand, demanding they come build a castle with her. And they did. 2 former criminals kneeling in the sand, helping their daughter build something that would be washed away by the tide, teaching her that some things were worth doing even when they didn't last forever. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the world in shades of amber and rose, Lucien understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. He'd spent his life chasing power because he thought it would make him safe, thought that if he became dangerous enough, feared enough, untouchable enough, no one could ever hurt him again. But power hadn't made him safe. It had just made him lonely. What made him safe was this. A woman who saw his darkness and chose him anyway. A daughter who knew nothing of empires and everything about joy. A life built not on fear, but on the radical decision to keep trying despite everything they'd done. That night, after Hope was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Serafina found Lucien on the balcony again, staring at stars he'd never had time to notice in his old life. What are you thinking about? She asked. The first time I saw you, Lucien said, walking down that aisle. I thought you were going to ruin everything I'd built. I did ruin it. No. He pulled her close. You saved me from it. There's a difference. And now? Now I'm thinking about how lucky I am. He kissed the top of her head. That you were stubborn enough to see something worth saving. That you fought beside me instead of running. That you gave me a reason to become someone different. You gave yourself that reason. Serafina looked up at him. I just reminded you it was there. They stood together in the darkness. 2 people who'd burned down the world and built something better from the ashes. Behind them, their daughter slept peacefully, dreaming whatever children dreamed, probably nothing about violence or empires or the cost of survival. And for the first time in his life, Lucien Vale felt something he'd never believed was possible. Peace. Not the absence of danger, not the illusion of control, just the quiet certainty that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Years later, decades later, when Hope was grown and building her own life, when Lucien's hair had gone gray and Serafina's paintings hung in galleries across the country under her real name, When the past had faded enough that even the nightmares rarely came anymore, they returned to New York, just once, just to see. The city had changed. New buildings where old ones stood, different names on different territories. The empire Lucien had built was gone, absorbed or dismantled, replaced by younger men making the same mistakes for the same reasons. They stood outside the building where they'd gotten married that first time, where everything had started, and Lucien felt nothing but distance. "Do you regret any of it?" Serafina asked. Lucien thought about all the blood, all the bodies, all the lines crossed in the name of survival and revenge and love. Thought about Antonio bleeding out on his desk, about Volkov in that warehouse, about everyone who died in the war they'd started. "I regret the cost," he said finally, "but not the outcome. Because we survived. Because we learned how to live." He took her hand and they walked away from the past one final time. And that's rarer than you'd think. They flew back to Vancouver that night, back to the life they'd built, back to the daughter who'd never known them as anything other than parents who loved her fiercely and checked locks twice. And as the plane lifted off, leaving New York shrinking behind them, Lucien realized the profound truth he'd spent his whole life fighting against. Being loved completely was more powerful than being feared. Being known fully was braver than being untouchable. And being human, flawed, broken, struggling, was the hardest empire to build. But it was also the only one worth keeping.